911. Where's your emergency?
My wife just stabbed herself. There's no pulse. There's blood all over the place.
New tonight, the 911 call from a husband in Madison County. He claimed his wife took her own life, but now he is charged in her death. Those charges are the result of a months-long investigation. Police say Kyle Long made that 911 call you just heard back in October. Here is his wife. Her name was Rachel. The sheriff tells ABC6.
The call came in just after midnight. A man's voice on the line sounded rushed, strained, almost panicked. He told the dispatcher that something terrible had happened inside his home. His wife was bleeding. He didn't understand how it happened. According to him, she had somehow caused the injuries herself. Within minutes, patrol cars were racing toward the address. When officers arrived, the house looked quiet from the outside. No broken windows, no loud arguments spilling into the street, just a porch light glowing above the front door. The husband was waiting. He appeared shaken, speaking quickly as he tried to explain what he claimed had happened. His words came out in fragments. He repeated the same explanation again and again, insisting that his wife had somehow turned the violence on herself. But the moment officers stepped inside, the situation stopped making sense. They moved through the hallway toward the master bathroom, where the husband said he had found her. The scene inside forced them to stop in their tracks. There was blood on the floor, blood along the edge of the bathtub, blood on the nearby walls. And in the middle of that room lay Rachel. The injuries were severe, far beyond what most officers would ever expect to see in a case where someone supposedly harmed themselves. Even before forensic teams arrived, one thing was clear. The explanation they had just heard didn't match the scene in front of them. Officers began asking questions. How could this have happened the way the husband described? Why did the injuries look like someone had tried desperately to fight back? And why did the man standing in the hallway keep repeating the same strange story? Those first few minutes inside the home set off a chain of questions that investigators would spend months trying to answer. But before we go any further, if you enjoy real true crime stories that examine the details behind cases like this, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Stories Chronicles, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Cases like this raise difficult questions. Have you ever heard of a situation where someone tried to mislead police after a violent crime? Because in this case, what the husband told officers that night wasn't just unusual. According to the sheriff, it was a shocking cover story. Rachel was simply known as someone who loved animals, cared deeply for her family, and worked hard to build a life she could be proud of. Rachel M. Brown. Long was born on December 22, 1992, in Columbus, Ohio, and grew up in the nearby community of London. It was the kind of town where people often crossed paths at the same grocery stores, school events, and local restaurants. Rachel spent most of her childhood there, surrounded by family and familiar faces. Friends who knew her growing up described someone with a big personality and a quick sense of humor. She enjoyed music, spending time with friends, and being outdoors. But one thing that stood out about Rachel from a young age was her connection with animals. Dogs in particular seemed to respond to her naturally, and anyone who spent time around her noticed how comfortable she was caring for them. After graduating from London High School in 2011, Rachel began focusing on turning that passion into something meaningful. Over time, she built a small business centered around pet grooming and boarding. The business, known as Pawfect Pups Grooming and Boarding, became an important part of her life. Running a small business is never easy, especially in a smaller community where reputation means everything. But Rachel built trust with her clients through consistency and care. People who brought their dogs to her often said they felt comfortable leaving their pets with someone who genuinely enjoyed what she was doing. Outside of work, Rachel's life revolved around her children. She was the mother of 2 young daughters, and those who knew her say they were always her top priority. Friends recall seeing Rachel juggling work, school schedules, and everyday responsibilities while still finding ways to make ordinary moments feel special for her kids. Whether it was reading stories at night, planning small family outings, or simply spending time together at home, Rachel tried to create a sense of stability for them. One friend later shared a memory that captured Rachel's personality perfectly. She was the kind of person who would stop everything if someone needed help, the friend said. And when it came to her girls, they were the center of her world. Another friend described her this way: Rachel had this energy about her. She loved music, loved animals, loved her kids. If you walked into a room and she was there, you knew it. Her days were busy but purposeful. Running a business, caring for her daughters, maintaining friendships, and managing the responsibilities that come with adulthood kept her constantly moving. From the outside, it looked like Rachel had built a life that balanced work, motherhood, and independence. But those closest to her say that behind the scenes, not everything was as stable as it appeared. Rachel had been married to Kyle Long for about a decade. Like many long-term relationships, the marriage had gone through periods of stress. Friends would later say that conversations about separation had begun to surface in the months before her death. Rachel was reportedly thinking about changes in her life and what the future might look like for her and her children. Still, nothing about those conversations suggested the kind of tragedy that would soon follow. The people who knew Rachel best say she was looking forward to moving forward, focusing on her children and continuing to grow her business. What no one around her could have predicted was that the person who would soon become the focus of a murder investigation was someone she had shared her home with for years. And as detectives would eventually discover, the truth behind what happened inside that house was far more complicated than the explanation first given that night. For many years, their lives followed a path that looked familiar to people around them. They had built a household together, shared responsibilities, and raised 2 daughters. To outsiders, their marriage appeared like many others in their community. 2 people navigating work, family life, and the everyday challenges that come with long-term relationships. But relationships rarely reveal their full reality to the outside world. Friends recall Rachel opening up more about her personal life during that time. She spoke about wanting to focus on her children and continue building her grooming business. She was proud of the work she had done to establish Pawfect Pups Grooming and Boarding, and she often talked about expanding the business and creating a better future for her daughters. Like many couples facing long-term strain, the problems had developed slowly over time. When 2 people share years together, it can be difficult to pinpoint the exact moment things start to change. Sometimes disagreements grow more frequent. Other times, communication becomes strained, leaving both people feeling unheard or disconnected. For many people, that kind of transition is difficult but manageable. Relationships end every day, and while the process can be painful, most couples eventually move forward with their lives. But in some situations, the end of a relationship creates tension that runs deeper than ordinary conflict. When one partner begins planning a future that doesn't include the other, the emotional impact can be significant. Feelings of anger, fear, or resentment can build quietly. In some cases, the idea of losing control over the relationship or over the life that was once shared can push people toward decisions that have devastating consequences. Experts who study domestic homicide cases have often noted that periods of separation can be among the most dangerous times in a relationship. The moment when someone begins talking about leaving, moving out, or starting over can trigger intense reactions, especially when emotions are already running high. There's no single pattern that applies to every case, but investigators frequently see the same theme. Tension that has been building for months or even years finally reaches a breaking point. For Rachel, the future she envisioned seemed centered around independence, her children, and her work with animals. Friends described her as someone who was thinking ahead, trying to move toward a new stage in her life. What began as private relationship struggles would soon take a tragic turn, one that would bring police officers to the home she shared with her husband and begin an investigation that would draw national attention. And the events that followed would transform a troubled marriage into a murder case that investigators would spend months trying to fully understand. October 23, 2025 began like an ordinary day for Rachel Long. She woke up that morning in the home she shared with her husband in London, Ohio. Like many working parents, her day quickly filled with responsibilities. Running a small grooming and boarding business required long hours and constant attention. Dogs needed to be groomed, appointments had to be kept on schedule, and customers expected the same care and reliability she had built her reputation on. Rachel had worked hard to grow Pawfect Pups Grooming and Boarding into something the community trusted. For her clients, she wasn't just a groomer. She was someone they believed truly cared about their pets. That Thursday appeared to follow her normal routine. Throughout the day, she communicated with customers and handled the responsibilities of her business. There were no signs that anything unusual was about to happen. At some point during the evening, Rachel also exchanged messages with a friend. The conversation wasn't about conflict or distress. Instead, the two were discussing something far more ordinary. Rachel talked about attending an upcoming concert and what she planned to wear. The messages showed someone who seemed engaged with life, making plans for events that hadn't even happened yet. Those texts would later become an important detail in the investigation because they revealed Rachel's mindset shortly before her death. Nothing in the conversation suggested that she was in emotional distress or contemplating harming herself. After finishing her work that day, Rachel returned home. The house she shared with Kyle Long appeared quiet. It was the same place where the two had spent years raising their daughters and living their daily lives. To anyone passing by that evening, nothing about the home would have suggested that anything unusual was about to unfold inside. But at some point later that night, something changed. Exactly what happened during those final moments inside the house is still a question that investigators would spend months trying to piece together. What is known is that the situation escalated into violence. At approximately 11 p.m., a call was placed to emergency dispatchers. On the other end of the line was Kyle Long. His voice sounded shaken as he explained that something terrible had happened to his wife. He told the dispatcher that Rachel had gone into the bathroom and that moments later he heard sounds that alarmed him. When he went to check on her, he said he found her injured and bleeding. During the call, he insisted that Rachel had somehow caused the injuries herself. He repeated the explanation several times, trying to describe what he believed had happened. The dispatcher stayed on the line, asking questions while emergency responders were sent to the address. Within minutes, police officers and paramedics were on their way. When they arrived, Kyle met them outside the home and continued explaining the situation. He told them where Rachel was inside the house and repeated his claim about how the injuries occurred. But when first responders entered the residence and moved toward the bathroom, what they encountered immediately raised concerns. Rachel was lying on the floor. The amount of blood present in the room was significant. The injuries visible on her body were severe. Emergency personnel quickly realized that there was nothing they could do to save her. Rachel Long was pronounced dead at the scene. While paramedics stepped back, police officers began examining the room more closely. The explanation given during the 911 call suggested a very specific scenario, that Rachel had somehow inflicted the injuries herself. But the physical evidence inside the bathroom didn't appear to support that claim. Officers observed the position of Rachel's body, the blood patterns inside the room, and the condition of the surrounding area. There were also injuries on her arms and hands that immediately stood out. Those types of wounds are often referred to as defensive injuries, the kind people receive when they instinctively try to protect themselves during an attack. Investigators began documenting everything they saw. Photographs were taken. The room was secured. Evidence markers were placed throughout the area. As detectives arrived and began reviewing the initial findings, a troubling picture started to form. If Rachel had truly caused the injuries herself, the physical evidence inside that bathroom would need to match that explanation. But as investigators looked more closely at the scene, more and more details began raising questions. And the evidence inside that home would soon begin to contradict the story that had been told during that late-night call for help. In the hours after Rachel Long was pronounced dead, the focus inside the house shifted from emergency response to investigation. The bathroom where she was found quickly became the center of attention. Officers secured the area and began documenting everything in detail. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, and detectives carefully observed the layout of the room. Every item, every mark, and every stain could potentially help explain what had happened. The explanation given during the emergency call suggested that Rachel had somehow caused the injuries herself. That claim was repeated when officers first arrived. According to the husband, the situation unfolded quickly. He said he heard sounds that alarmed him, went to check on his wife, and found her already injured. However, the evidence inside the room told a different story. Rachel had suffered multiple stab wounds. The number of injuries alone drew attention from investigators. Even more concerning were the cuts found on her arms and hands. Those injuries are commonly associated with someone trying to block or push away a weapon during an attack. As the investigation continued, detectives began reviewing every piece of information they could gather. They spoke with people who had interacted with Rachel earlier that day and collected statements about her activities in the hours leading up to the incident. Those conversations helped establish a timeline. Rachel had spent the day focused on her work and normal responsibilities. There was nothing unusual about her behavior. Friends later shared that she had been communicating with them shortly before the incident, discussing plans for an upcoming concert. Those messages became an important part of the investigation. At the same time, detectives began taking a closer look at the husband's statements. His explanation had remained largely the same from the moment the emergency call was placed. But investigators needed to determine whether that version of events could realistically match the evidence they were seeing. During interviews, officers asked detailed questions about the timeline inside the home. When did Rachel enter the bathroom? What exactly did he hear before going to check on her? How long passed between discovering the injuries and making the emergency call? Each answer was carefully recorded and compared to the physical evidence collected at the scene. At one point during the investigation, portions of the emergency call were reviewed again. The recording captured the moment the husband tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher. "Dispatch, what's going on there?" the operator asked. "My wife, she's bleeding," the caller responded. "I don't know how this happened." "Is she breathing?" I don't think so. She went into the bathroom, and then I heard something. When I went in, she was already like this." Detectives listened closely to every detail of that conversation. The tone of the call, the timing of the responses, and the explanation provided all became part of the larger investigation. As forensic teams completed their examination of the home, the gap between the physical evidence and the husband's explanation continued to widen. The injuries Rachel suffered were severe. The pattern of those wounds suggested repeated attacks rather than a single moment of self-harm. And the defensive injuries indicated that Rachel had tried to protect herself during the violence. By this point, investigators were no longer simply trying to understand what had happened inside the house. They were trying to determine whether the story they had been told from the beginning could possibly be true. Because if the evidence inside that bathroom was accurate, and forensic science would later confirm that it was, then the explanation provided during that emergency call was deeply misleading. The investigation was now moving in a new direction. But here's a question for you. Do you think investigators recognized immediately that something about the story didn't add up, or did it take time for the truth to slowly come into focus? Let me know what you think in the comments. Because as detectives continued examining the evidence, one thing became clear. The explanation that had been given that night was beginning to fall apart. In the days immediately following Rachel Long's death, investigators knew they were dealing with a complicated case. The scene inside the home had raised serious questions, but reaching a clear conclusion required patience, evidence, and time. What began as an emergency response quickly developed into a long and methodical investigation. If Rachel had truly caused the injuries herself, investigators would expect to see signs of emotional turmoil or unusual behavior beforehand. But the evidence they were finding pointed in the opposite direction. Meanwhile, forensic specialists continued analyzing the injuries Rachel had suffered. The findings were consistent with what officers at the scene had already suspected. The number of wounds and the presence of defensive injuries suggested that Rachel had tried to protect herself during the attack. With each new detail, the gap between the husband's account and the evidence continued to grow. What he had described during the emergency call now appeared increasingly difficult to reconcile with the findings collected from the scene. Months passed as detectives reviewed reports, conducted interviews, and compared forensic results. Cases involving violent deaths often require extensive analysis, especially when investigators must rule out multiple possibilities. Authorities needed to be certain that every conclusion they reached was supported by evidence. Eventually, after reviewing the full scope of the investigation, detectives reached a point where the direction of the case changed dramatically. The explanation that Rachel had somehow caused the injuries herself could no longer be supported by the evidence. Instead, the investigation now pointed toward a very different conclusion. Rachel Long's death was no longer being viewed as a tragic accident or self-inflicted incident. Detectives now believed something else had happened inside that home, and that realization marked a major turning point in the case. Because once investigators reached that conclusion, the focus of the investigation shifted toward a far more serious possibility, one that would eventually lead authorities to take decisive action. During that time, Rachel's family and friends were left waiting for answers. For them, the loss was immediate and devastating. Rachel had been more than just a business owner or a familiar face in the community. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend, and someone who had been working hard to create a future for her children. The sudden and violent nature of her death left people struggling to understand how such a tragedy could occur. Eventually, investigators believed they had gathered enough information to take the next step. In March of 2026, nearly 4 months after Rachel was found dead, authorities made a major development in the case. Kyle Long was arrested and charged with murder in connection with Rachel's death. The arrest marked a turning point not only for the investigation, but also for Rachel's family and the community that had been following the case. Law enforcement officials stated that the evidence collected during the investigation directly contradicted the explanation given on the night Rachel died. According to investigators, the findings from the crime scene, combined with the medical examiner's conclusions and other evidence gathered during the months that followed, supported the charge that Rachel's death was the result of a violent attack. Kyle Long was taken into custody and held at the Madison County Jail. A judge later set his bond at $1.5 million, reflecting the seriousness of the charge. As the legal process began, prosecutors started preparing their case while defense attorneys prepared to respond to the allegations. At this stage, the case officially moved from investigation into the court system, where the facts would be examined during legal proceedings. In the United States justice system, anyone accused of a crime is presumed innocent until proven guilty in court. That principle means that the evidence gathered by investigators must ultimately be presented before a judge and jury. For Rachel's family and friends, the arrest brought mixed emotions. On one hand, it represented progress toward accountability for what had happened. Many of the people who knew Rachel had been hoping that the investigation would eventually provide answers and that those responsible would face charges. But the arrest also brought a renewed wave of grief. It forced everyone who cared about Rachel to confront the reality that someone she had shared her life with for years now stood accused of taking that life away. As the case moved forward, Rachel's loved ones continued remembering the person she had been. And while the legal battle was just beginning, one thing remained certain for the people who knew Rachel best. The life she had built and the future she had been working toward had been cut short in a way no one could have imagined. Cases like Rachel Long's often lead investigators and analysts to examine a broader pattern that appears again and again in violent crimes involving couples. While every case has its own details and circumstances, many domestic homicide investigations share common themes that experts have been studying for decades. One of the most frequently discussed factors is the breakdown of a relationship. When long-term partnerships begin to fall apart, emotions can become intense and unpredictable. Feelings of betrayal, anger, resentment, or desperation may develop when one partner believes the relationship is coming to an end. In most situations, couples eventually separate and move forward with their lives. But in some cases, the tension surrounding a breakup becomes far more dangerous. Researchers who study domestic violence often point to one particular period that carries increased risk: the moment when one partner begins preparing to leave. The decision to separate can change the dynamic of a relationship quickly. A person who once felt secure may suddenly feel they are losing control over their home life, their family structure, or the future they imagined. When those emotions combine with anger or unresolved conflict, the situation can escalate in ways that are difficult to predict. Many domestic homicide cases follow a similar sequence. This does not mean every strained relationship becomes violent. Millions of couples separate every year without any harm coming to either person. But investigators often find that when violence does occur, the warning signs were present beforehand, even if they were only visible to the people closest to the situation. Another factor experts frequently discuss is isolation. When conflicts remain private, friends and family members may not fully understand how serious the situation has become. Arguments that happen behind closed doors can be difficult for outsiders to recognize. As a result, problems that might otherwise be addressed early can continue building without intervention. This is why many advocates emphasize the importance of support networks. Friends, relatives, and trusted members of the community can sometimes play a critical role in helping someone navigate a difficult relationship. Conversations with supportive people can offer perspective, encouragement, and practical options for moving forward safely. Communities also rely on resources designed to assist individuals facing relationship conflict or domestic violence. These resources can provide guidance, temporary housing, and counseling for people who may feel trapped in situations they do not know how to leave. In the aftermath of cases like Rachel's, investigators, advocates, and families often share the same hope: that awareness and open conversations about relationship safety might help prevent similar tragedies in the future. Because, while the details of each case may differ, the goal remains the same: to ensure that people facing dangerous situations have access to the support and information they need before conflict turns into violence. When a case like Rachel Long's appears in the headlines, it is often reduced to a few short sentences: a victim's name, the details of a violent crime, and the progress of a criminal case moving through the courts. But behind every headline is a real life that existed long before the tragedy. Rachel was not simply the subject of a news report. She was a mother raising 2 daughters who depended on her. She was a business owner who had spent years building a grooming service for people who trusted her with their pets. She was a daughter, a friend, and someone who had been making plans for the future only hours before her life was taken. The text messages she sent that evening about attending a concert show something that is easy to forget when reading about crimes like this. Rachel was thinking about ordinary things: music, plans with friends, the simple moments people look forward to during a busy week. Those plans never had the chance to happen. For her family and the people who knew her best, the loss left behind a silence that cannot easily be filled. The memories they hold on to now are the ones from before the investigation began: the laughter, the conversations, the moments spent with her children, and the dedication she showed to the work she loved. That is why support systems matter. Rachel's story is ultimately a reminder that every true crime case represents a real person whose life mattered. And now, I'd like to hear from you. What do you think investigators noticed first that made them question the husband's story? Was it the scene inside the bathroom, the injuries Rachel suffered, or something about the explanation given during that late-night call? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Conversations like these help keep attention on cases that deserve to be remembered. And if you want to hear more detailed true crime stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles and turn on notifications so you never miss our next investigation.